Thanks for tuning in to a special episode of Austin Public Library podcast with Jello Biafra, most infamously known for being the lead singer of the Dead Kennedys, who broke up in the 1980s but has since had a long career doing spoken word and political activism and continuing to sing in other music projects such as Lard and projects with the Melvins and Mojo Nixon. He's was in town last week to perform with Reverend Horton Heat at the Continental Club, and I had the opportunity to have a conversation with him about intellectual freedom and libraries. And I knew him from Boulder, Colorado, where we are both from, and I knew that his mother is a librarian in Colorado, or rather was a librarian in Colorado. So we got to meet up at 4 in the morning and have a conversation about intellectual freedom. So I'd like to begin by asking you to comment on something I just heard you comment a moment ago about your upbringing with your parents and how they were librarians and they...
No, actually only one parent was a librarian. My mother was head of interlibrary loan at the University of Colorado, and my father was a psychiatric social worker who had a variety of different kinds of jobs in that field when I was growing up. And I guess what we're talking about was that I guess looking back, I experienced more of a very tumultuous, wonderfully tumultuous time in American history in the 1960s, even though I was a child, and when 1970 rolled around, I was only 12. So born in 1958 and whatnot, but I was always a curious type, and I guess my interest in current affairs, world affairs, political this and that, it's not something I discovered or found. It's just more like it found me, or it was always around. Both, when we eventually got a TV in the house, there wasn't one for the first 4, maybe 5 years of my life. And then finally a TV came in, which I was initially kind of bummed about because it was black and white. When you turned it on, President Kennedy wasn't on the screen. When we were at the TV store, there was an entire wall of color TVs, and JFK giving a speech or something was on all of them. So I just looked up at this wall. Oh, hi, President Kennedy. And of course, that was also what was on when Kennedy was killed when I was in kindergarten. And I, even though I was 5, remember the day very well. Normally my mother was not prone to crying or anything, but she was crying for the second time that day. The first time being me being out of control or being like I usually am or whatever. And then what I do this time, Mom? The president is dead. And, it didn't take much explaining. And then there was nothing on but that for who knows how long. I didn't watch a lot of TV, but I did watch a cartoon or two around 5 o'clock, and then the national and the local news, I can't remember in which order, came on after that, and I just watched both with equal fascination. So saw the Berlin Wall go up and the formative stages of the Vietnam War, and of course the media was much less censored then. General Electric didn't own a TV network. Neither did Disney or Westinghouse or anybody who wanted the news department to reflect the agenda of corporate investors and things. And it also meant that all the 3 networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC, were all very competitive with each other over the quality of their news reporting. They didn't care if it made money. It was their status thing, which meant there would be hard-hitting expose-type documentaries like The Selling of the Pentagon later, or one about slave camp situations for people who were stuck there picking the oranges that went into Minute Maid orange juice, and that stuck with me too. So basically, I was just a news hound and saw Oswald get shot live in the living room and then again and again on instant replays. And of course, Kennedy's The Flag-Draped Coffin just lingered on the screen for days as people slowly filed past to say goodbye. And I realized it was a very sad, heavy moment and wondered if cartoons would ever come back. But it also meant that they discussed things with me and my younger sister as a way of trying to instilling values in people when the race riots were starting and the voting rights struggles in the South, which it now looks like we may find ourselves having to repeat in this election and stuff, which I never thought I'd see. But, you know, you see black people being hosed and getting dogs sicked on them, and my mother, the librarian, just saying, you know, I don't understand why somebody would hate somebody else for the color of their skin. And that kind of stuck with me. There was just no reason for that. Why? You know, you can drill things in one way or you can drill it in another way. I mean, one guy I was friends with for in 8th grade just hated the hell out of Germans and had probably never met one, but I can guess what war his father fought in and stuff. These things trickle down, but I am grateful that my parents chose not to hide the world from me. You know, even the bloody footage of what war really is going on in Vietnam, like they would never show today. You know, they didn't change the channel to something nicer or whatever. They would discuss it. And so I had very strong views from a very early age about war and civil rights and human rights and the environment. It was called conservation then. I mean, it was Boulder, Colorado, and then as now they've given it colors and they call the place a purple state. But even then, there was this endless tug of war between people from what was characterized nationally as the far left, the birth of the environmentalist movement, trying to keep the mountains from getting blown up and paved and turned into nothing but ski areas and mines and stuff. And the ranchers who wanted every coyote and wolf and everything else dead, and they didn't care who else they poisoned to get that. You know, that, you know, on one side, and, you know, people wanted to preserve that, people didn't. And Governor John Love in the 60s a Republican ran under the slogan, "Sell Colorado." You know, we could have all this great stuff coming in. It's such a nice place. And he got reelected, and not always by a lot, but that was just the way things were. I mean, people were just engaged. You know, I don't think it was just me, even though people I grew up with then don't seem to remember these things the way I do. But even around 4th grade, age 9, I mean, you knew who was for and who was against the Vietnam War. And then in the next year, in 5th grade, it was 1968, the very hard-fought election. You think Donald Trump or George W. Bush was a divisive figure. You never saw Richard Nixon. And on that one, there was even a segregationist running who would be even closer to what the Tea Party would be today, George Wallace, the segregation forever governor of Alabama. And we had the secret ballot election in 2 5th grade classes, and one person voted for Wallace. And the talk went on for weeks after that. Who was it? Who was it? Who was it? So, you know, people had feelings about these things. And also, a little bit earlier, 2nd grade, fall of 1965, was when I guess my father was trying to get me to shut up and go to sleep, and turned on a radio, brought the radio in the room, played around. Well, maybe you like this, you like this, like this. I heard rock and roll for the first time, and then there was no stopping me. No, leave it here, leave it here. So I was a big music hound. Even as a 7-year-old, I couldn't collect vinyl then. They wouldn't let me have a record player, let alone buy records, or even have an allowance. But I collected it all in my head and remembered what songs I liked, wondered when I would get to hear them again, why did I have to listen to this other stuff in order to hear that, etc. So I was very passionate. I'm very grateful I got to be as aware as I was and experience all the cool stuff and the other stuff that went on in the 60s, as so it's very, very much a part of me, and got both the events and the political stuff and the music all at once. Because, of course, by the late 60s, it was all connected.
Earlier this evening, you mentioned your parents wanted you to be aware of, not hidden from what was going on. Do you feel other classmates of your generation, that was not the case? Do you think your mother is a librarian?
I'm guessing not, because so many people, even when by the time I was 30 or so, and I'm 58 now, were saying, "Oh, I don't remember much anything from back then," or one was, "So you remember more of my old childhood than I do. Why did that happen?" But then I'll like hum a theme from a TV commercial back then or something, and they'll remember it. Bingo. I think that was part of it too.
Well, before we move on to censorship, and actually you said a couple other things I hope to...
Well, censorship was something I was very aware of from an early age too. I mean, everything from fighting with or even saying bad things about my little sister, they would come down on me pretty hard, and I had a sense of injustice and anger. You know, and you know, my cynicism about the rest of the world got applied to my family as well, and that was quite a volatile situation at times. And I guess the first, and I was kind of aware that people in dictatorships and communist countries were not allowed to criticize the government and had to be very careful about what they said. Kind of like the American public school system, only worse. So that didn't sit well with me either. And I guess the first act of serious censorship that really broke my heart was one of my whole family's favorite shows, The Smothers Brothers, got canceled by CBS because of the content of their show. And even I, as a 10 or 11-year-old, when they were getting more and more blatant, just baiting Nixon and Spiro Agnew and whatnot, I'm like, how are they getting away with this? And then all of a sudden one day, poof, they're off the air. It was sometime around then, too, that they launched a variety show with then really popular singer Petula Clark of Downtown and Don't Sleep in the Subway, Darling, Round Every Corner fame. That Petula Clark, she was huge. And she held hands with one of her guests at one point. Held hands with Harry Belafonte, a black man, a Negro. Having him on her show was controversial enough, apparently. But that caused Chrysler to pull its sponsorship from the show, and the show was canceled. And so I guess I was pretty aware of this kind of thing and how precious freedom of expression can be, and that even if it's not the police, it can be the power of sponsors, advertisers, and corporations who find other ways to censor things.
You mentioned JFK being killed, and obviously you're in a band called the Dead Kennedys. Did you ever run into problems with just the name alone?
Oh, that was why I was so into the name. I mean, I have this long list of names for bands. It keeps growing. I've used it in spoken word shows, and Dead Kennedys wasn't on it. It was suggested to me at a party in the very, very early days of the Colorado punk scene. And I thought Rick Stott from Trade a Tape, who later managed the Ravers, Colorado's first punk band, moved out west, and he and I were very, very close till we lost Rick, unfortunately. And Or another guy, Mark Bleasner, who went a drummer and journalist, went by the name of Radio Pete at the time. Went on later to do things like manage the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. I mean, he's a music biz guy that me and Bob Furbish know to this day. But one or the other, and Rick finally said no, it was Radio Pete who did it first. So, what would really be a wild name for a band is Dead Kennedys. And then later, me and Ray and Klaus are trying to come up with a name for the band. And the first one I wanted was Thalidomide. I thought that would be a nice little spine-tingling, eye-catching name for a punk rock band designed to annoy people and put the value and shock value, as punk did so well. And none of them were into that. So then I says, well, what about Dead Kennedys? And they really weren't into that. And Ray was like, well, record companies will never sign us with a name like that. And of course I thought, yes, I don't want to sign with those people anyway. And so I started telling people in the Dills and Negative Trend and others that was going to be the name of the band. And then Ray and Klaus couldn't get rid of it. And it was that point when I realized the reaction to it, how they recoiled, that you realized the power of the name. And that if I was going to use a name like that, I'd better be ready to catch some shit and lose some opportunities and stuff. Little did I know that there was already a Cleveland band called Dead Kennedys, and Radio Pete knew who they were. And so then I go to a store in Berkeley called Rather Ripped, and one of the guys, Ray Farrell, working there, who later worked at SST and Enigma and E-Music and many other things, was saying, yeah, I liked your interview in Clay, CLE. That's a Cleveland magazine. They have an article about us. We only played 3 shows. And I look and, this isn't us. This is a different band. And so then I wrote somebody I'd been getting the Cleveland area records off of, Nick Nicholas from the Bizarros. And he wrote back, no, don't worry. They changed their name because nobody would give them a gig. I realized once again I'd chosen well to go west instead of east in search of a dream, because Boulder was just, and the Denver area was still mainly like a ground zero testing ground for the next Eagles or Scientology jazz fusion and stuff like that. And there was a little bit of a punk scene, but not like what was going on in New York, and let alone the even more extreme stuff I ran into on the West Coast that I ultimately became part of. And but in San Francisco, it was, the shows were at the Mabuhay Gardens were all ages. That was important because a lot of us were under 21. Key difference between the West and New York, for example. And they thought nothing of a band called Dead Kennedys. I mean, even Dirk Dirksen at the Mabuhay, who enjoyed all the shock, was a little weird about the name at first, but got used to it. My father was more bummed out about California Uber Alice because he was a big Jerry Brown supporter at the time. But in time, it's an example of going with your hunches as an artist. I mean, wouldn't it be great to set this firecracker off and see what happens? And let's call a song "Kill the Poor." Oh, now we need lyrics. Go with your hunches and then fill in the blanks in a way you can defend it too. I knew it would have to be defended. And to me, it was a reaction against the sheer cynicism and the selfish me generation stuff that would give birth to the Reagan era 2 years after Dead Kennedys formed. And, that kind of apathy and everything, the post-60s letdown of the 70s, and trying to get to the bottom of that. And that, and then obviously a lot of the cynicism happened with not just John F. Kennedy's killing, but Robert Kennedy too, and Martin Luther King. People felt like they had no more stake in the future of society in general. I'll just be out for myself. And then eventually, when he finally embraced it, Ray said it meant to him that it meant the death of the American dream. And I thought that was a good explanation too. And I realized why you need to be able to defend this stuff, both because I have a label, Alternative Tentacles, and had to realize that, I can't put out anything I can't defend. I will defend the artist's right to have it exist, but if I can't defend it, I can't put my label name on it, which happened when one band I was really hot on, and the album opened with a really horrible homophobic song, and I was just like, I can't do this. I cannot defend this. Plus, it really upset me, so not into the bigotry thing. So, yeah.
I recently saw an interview with Bill Hicks, and he said comedy's the last bastion of free speech. Do you think musicians have the same freedom to express themselves in a way that perhaps other people don't have that outlet?
Well, I wouldn't restrict it to comedy. I think art in general is, if not the last, but the main bastion of free speech. And it's harder to cut through in a country where it's so corporatized now, and our country loves stars but hates artists, especially at the funding level. We don't even want you on our major music label unless you're going to be the next Britney Spears or Guns N' Roses or Adele or whatever. And we'd rather be like movie studios and blow millions a year on blockbusters and hope one of the blockbusters doesn't tank than nurture a bunch of really cool music, because hey, nobody works here anymore, music fans. We could just be selling weed killer. We don't care. It wasn't always that way, and thankfully punk brought back the avenue of the independent release. But yeah, I think if you want to measure how important free speech and arts is, notice who are the first people who get rounded up and jailed or even killed if a dictatorship as horrible as Stalin or Pinochet takes over. He made sure right away they rounded up a very popular, beloved political folk singer named Victor Jara, and they executed him right then and there. They knew that would shut a lot of other people up and scare the living daylights of them. It would be like America just one day taking Bob Dylan out in the street and shooting him through the back of the head, or killing Springsteen or something because you don't like what he said about President Trump or something like that. Of course, Charlie Chaplin was run out of this country as a suspected communist, and others were attacked there too. And part of it was not just beliefs they may or may not have had. It was what their art exposed and poked fun of.
And John Lennon went through the same thing.
Oh, of course, yeah. And many of us did, thanks to Al Gore's wife, Tipper, and her allies on the religious right. People forget that all the other co-founders of her parents' music resource centers were joined at the hip with focus on the family and the moral majority and Pat Robertson. Tipper was merely acting as a knowing front, as was her husband when he held the anti-music hearings, and the major labels. And this is maybe the worst form of censorship in this country, is when corporations do it by omission, leaving every other important story out of the news except what did Donald Trump do today, or what did the Kardashians do today? And if there's nothing there, then, let's see, where's the terror threat today? Oh, nobody's scared right now? Oh, let's see, how about some drug cartels? But not go into nearly as much detail on nearly as many stories as they did before General Electric and Westinghouse and Disney and Rupert Murdoch seized control of mass broadcast media, and it gets more and more dumbed down every year. Even MSNBC has gotten much more dumbed down and much more knee-jerk corporate conservative, even in the last 2 years, as measured in part by who they keep kicking off the air and who they replace it with. And this goes on in book publishing, in music, high and low, but especially the more high up in the commercial marketplace you get, the more tightly restricted things are. They want to sell you love songs and sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or sex, drugs, and bitch this, bitch that hip hop or whatever, because it distracts from other things. And Allen Ginsberg pointed out, as far as the power of the arts too, was the whole reason people get so obsessed with trying to censor everybody from Robert Mapplethorpe to Henry Miller to D.H. Lawrence to my own band, thanks to Tipper Gore and others, is his theory is if they can actually make you afraid of your own sexuality and pleasure impulses, they can control the rest of your mind too from there. And that's a very, very strong point, and things are always getting pushed that way. And if it's not sex, we're in a really kind of disturbing period right now where a new generation of people from different walks of life who are experimenting with their own ways of wanting to be radical and want more change than the corporate power structure wants to give them, trying to find their own way and things to be angry at, have come down very hard on the content of both art and what people are exposed to, not just in public elementary through high school, but even on college campuses, where they want certain things omitted. Ooh, here's some native aboriginals from long ago paddling a canoe on a river in Wisconsin. That might be a racial stereotype. We have to take the painting down after 100 years because it might offend somebody. And because one person might be offended, then there must be trigger warnings when teaching class. Warning, what I'm about to say might offend you. And ironically, a lot of this is coming from people who would normally be considered very progressive in trying to open people's minds. But to me, it's no different than when I was on a panel about music censorship, right when Bill Clinton picked Al Gore and thus Tipper to run with him in 1992, and people who wanted freedom of music were a little alarmed at that. I was on a panel at CMJ, the College Music Journal Convention in New York, and whenever I'm on a censorship panel, especially if it's a music industry thing, I insist that some of the censors also be on the panel, that the extreme right and the fundamentalist Christians be represented, because otherwise, number one, we're kind of denying them their say as well, like they're trying to do to us, but number two, the stuff that comes out of their mouths makes Ted Cruz look like a rational person by comparison. And if they're not allowed to say that in front of people who normally wouldn't be exposed to them, people, especially in the music industry or a little bubble, they don't think these people actually exist, let alone how much power they have, let alone how many followers they have who vote. And in this case, one of the people on this panel in New York, 1992, was Brent Bozell, second generation right-wing extremist, anti-abortion thug, and whatnot. And he laid it out that this music has to go, and this has to go, and these lyrics have to be stopped and bleeped out, or the whole album pulled, or whatever, because these lines offend me as a Catholic. As though every single songwriter, musician, let alone writer, journalist, should tailor their content to what is acceptable from an extremely conservative, fundamentalist Catholic. And that is no different from saying you have to kick this book out of the curriculum because some of what it said in the 19th century about African Americans is unacceptable. And, even something like in Mark Twain's, Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer books, using the word nigger, that's what you call a teachable moment. not a reason to pull or black out parts of the book. I even said that on Oprah Winfrey and Phil Donahue. If you as a parent are really offended by something that your kid is listening to or a violent video game, don't just take the whole thing away. They'll just go check it out at their friend's house or learn how to sneak it next time because you, the parent, have just defined yourself as the enemy. No, sit down and talk to them. Do you realize the person in this song is talking about raping a woman? Do you understand what rape really is? And the answer you're all likelihood to get is, no, and or, I don't really listen to the words anyway. Which most people, unfortunately, especially at that age, don't.
I was thinking of your TV appearances when you're talking about the panel inviting the other side. You've met Tipper Gore on TV and in the courtroom, or
no, not in the courtroom.
Just on TV.
No, she created and along with Ed Meese and his anti-porn commission and the attacks on Robert Mapplethorpe and whatnot, and it created this climate where a cynical politician, in this case a Democrat, named James Hahn, who was city attorney of L.A., and just a complete second-generation incompetent who was only in public office because his dad was in public office, which L.A. found out the hard way when they made him mayor several years later, and then he got booted after one term because he just was such a visionless bumbler. But anyway, he decided he could make a name for himself and maybe be mayor someday if he was the first guy on the block to bust a musician over the content of an album and put him on trial. And apparently they thought I was going to plead guilty and pay a $50 fine, and then they could use that precedent to go after Ozzy Osbourne, AC/DC, Prince. Hip-hop hadn't quite broken through with NWA or Public Enemy or Ice-T or any of them yet. That was only a couple of years later when Tipper Gore, to her great glee, began playing the race card, just like they did against Little Richard and Chuck Berry and Fats Domino to get all of rock and roll kicked off the air in the late 50s, early 60s. Same thing. And so, and I knew where this ugliness came from. And Tipper denied it. Oh, I'm a liberal feminist. I'm just trying to protect my children. But the second time I was on Oprah and I knew she wasn't going to let me talk, she herself is a fundamentalist Christian who was very much on Tipper's side of things. And so I knew I'd only get one chance and then she'd never let me talk again. So I just strung out my case and mentioned, even though she claimed she had nothing to do with my arrest and trial, and even told the Philadelphia Inquirer, oh, I respect Jello Biafra. Well, in a Nashville paper, she said the opposite. She said I'd like to take credit for it. And she denied saying those very words, so I pulled the paper out of my pocket and showed her where she said those very words, and the crowd began to hiss at her and stuff, and mentioned, since Rabbi Abraham Cooper of the Wiesenthal Center was on that panel because of anti-Semitic Guns N' Roses and Ice Cube lyrics and whatnot. You should watch who you get in bed with on this, because the rest of Tipper's key allies are all active anti-Semites. And he perked up when I mentioned names like the Eagle Forum, where, Phyllis Schlafly's hate group that Tipper had spoken at as an invited guest, knew about that. And so I nailed her pretty good. And Oprah cut to a commercial, and I was never allowed to speak another word on the Oprah Winfrey Show. But I made my point.
And that's what I was thinking of when you were talking about having the other side in your panels and the audience hearing them. When you pulled the paper out and showed it to Tipper.
Yeah, I also wore a suit and a tie on those shows because I figured that, any, housewife who watches these shows in the middle of the day when other people have jobs and stuff and is vulnerable to falling for these people and putting their kid in a mental hospital for listening to Dead Kennedys or metal or whatever, if I showed up not looking like I was in Motley Crue or Sid Vicious or whatever, it was like, no, look at me, I'm nice. This is what I'm a respectable citizen. Ha ha ha! The value of the Halloween costume. Figured if it could keep one kid from getting locked in a mental home just because of their music or because they liked punk or something, then mission accomplished. And Mike Muir's suicidal tendencies, of course, dressed with a big old headband and everything else, and, put me down for dressing like that on the show. But I stand by my tactic because other, old ladies from the Donahue crowd came up to me afterwards and said that Muir really scared them. And you're not trying to scare people because ideally, a lot of these things that people want banned, they've never actually heard, seen, read, whatever. They've just heard about it. Or they're being told this is what you should attack. The Parents Music Resource Center had begun extending their attacks from major label artists where Ozzy Osbourne will make you kill yourself, AC/DC causes juvenile delinquency, and Judas Priest causes devil worship, and Prince causes, Tipper Gore's daughter might masturbate when behind her back, something like that. Then they extended it to Dead Kennedys, and but even after all the uproar, even within the band about including H.R. Giger's painting landscape number 20, Where Are We Going?, which has then been retitled, but not by him, Penis Landscape, never guessed that I would wind up being Tipper's pigeon when Jimmy Hahn did file those charges in L.A. to try and make a national name for himself and be the first person on the block to actually convict a musician and stuff. No music album had ever been tried for its content in American history. Two Live Crew was 2 or 3 years later. And at first, my own attorney, the same Rick Stott from Boulder, says, oh yeah, you're charged in L.A. Oh, great. Thinking I probably would be some slap on the wrist in a court hearing. Rick said, no, you don't understand. CBS is calling, CNN is calling, etc., etc. And then I thought, oh my God, I'm Tipper's pigeon. Okay, that means I have to fight. Who knows, maybe if he hadn't publicized it so much and done it under the radar like the attacks on John Waters and Guar and others over the years and Patti Smith, well, maybe there just would have been a quick slap on the wrist. But I knew the ramifications, and luckily I had a roommate at the time who had been doing an expose on Tipper and the Parents Music Resource Center, so I was armed with a lot of knowledge, plus my own experiences with the religious right and realizing what the real agenda was here. First being exposed when Mr. Thompson, the principal of my middle school, Baseline Junior High, yelled at me and another guy for a good 20 to 30 minutes on why God wanted us to be more serious about PE class. And I had to sit there and nod along, even though I realized this guy is out of his mind and he's the one who's got power. And then my friend John Greenway, the one who wrote the original lyrics to California Uber Alice and stuff that I grew up with, we were, imagine Beavis and Butthead with brains. That was us. But he found these little religious comic books that are called tracts, published by Chick Publications. And here was all the Illuminati stuff and the Jesuits causing the Holocaust and God hates you for this reason, God hates music for that reason, the Druids infected rock and roll, all Christian rock musicians are dupes of the devil because they're playing Druid rhythms. Now I'm talking over several years of Chick Publications and those tracts. But when people are saying, oh, Jerry Falwell isn't serious when he thinks he can tell Reagan what to do and he wants to make everybody worship the same God he does and execute people for being gay, and I'm like, no, people, these people are serious. I have experience with them. They're out of their skulls, but they have way too much power, and this is what they want to do with it, and this is why we fight them with music, like Dead Kennedys and God We Trust Incorporated, EP, and many others. And so ultimately, I wound up being one of the main national point people, Frank Zappa being the bigger one, against censorship of music and the arts, and was exhausted doing all these interviews and trying to fundraise to defend ourselves at this trial and everything else. And it took a lot out of me, but ultimately it was a good thing because it really exposed Tipper and the Parents Music Resource Center for what they were. And they had a lot more trouble getting away with this stuff after that. And getting, some local sheriff to go nuts on somebody or go attack a comic book store or whatever. It helped put a damper on that, I think. And, of course, Jimmy Hahn in L.A. couldn't go bust bigger musicians when he was unable to convict me. In the end, a year and a half later, after a 3-week trial, the jury was deadlocked 7-5 in favor of acquittal. The prosecutor, Michael Guarino, who was like George Bush Sr., a younger one with a beetle do, he filed for a new trial, and because it was a mistrial, hung jury, and thankfully the judge denied it, although she said, I hope the defendants have learned their lesson. I'm like, yeah, but not the one you think, lady. But ironically, Guarino later apologized to me for the whole thing. Said that they picked us, he had no idea my lyrics were socially relevant. And that was why he fought so hard to keep the lyrics out of the trial. And so they couldn't be introduced as evidence. And later told Option magazine that as soon as he lost the battle to keep the lyrics out, he realized he was probably going to lose the case.
Well, actually, I didn't know that, and that's interesting because, for example, challenging a book in the library, you're supposed to look at the book as a whole, not just the thing that's a problem. So I didn't realize that they couldn't look at your lyrics as part of the whole.
Well, they were able to. They wanted to just restrict it to H.R. Giger's art, and they were hoping to charge him, but he was in Switzerland, so that wasn't going to work. So they tried to see, it was a law called Distribution of Harmful Matter, which had never been used before. It was recently passed, aimed at the porn industry, but I don't think they ever used it again. And they wanted to see, okay, who can we convict under this law? They wanted me not as the artist, but because I owned the record company. They wanted the record company owner, and let's charge the wholesaler, let's charge the retailer. Okay, the retailer play ball with us and give up the name of the wholesaler. Let's charge the distributor, More Damn Records, who sold it to the wholesaler. So let's see who in the chain we can get. They were just experimenting with the law, basically. But the public target was me. And I fought back very publicly. I mean, knowing even if we lost the case, which I was terribly nervous about, knowing there would be a precedent and the whole music industry would want to strangle me and hang me from a light pole and stuff. And I couldn't let that. Maybe I exaggerated that in my mind, but I was very frightened of that. But, oh yeah, like I said, all right, just a way of, in a way, putting a chilling effect on any more of those kind of prosecutions. Ironically, to piggyback on this, the Houston Police Department, who at that point was one of the most notoriously violent and murderous in the entire United States, and they picked up a kid who they'd known as from other run-ins with the law as a juvenile delinquent, said, we got you on this charge, you're going to the joint for a long time, but we'll let you go if you will go into this record store we want to attack and buy Dead Kennedy's Frankenchrist album. And so this frightened kid goes up and buys Frankenchrist. The cops storm in and get ready to drag the clerk away and everything else, only to discover their horror that the kid had bought a cassette instead of a vinyl LP, and there's no way you can insert a poster into a cassette box, so it didn't have it. That was the end of their attempt to piggyback on that one. So there was a lot of weird comic relief, and there were silver linings, like getting to meet and spend time with Frank Zappa, which I will always treasure. And he told me at the beginning, after he heard about the charges, he found my number and called me and said, remember, you are the victim, not the teenage girl who bought the record. You're the victim. And whatever you do it with dignity. And that was very good advice that I've passed on to other artists who find themselves facing criminal charges on something that shouldn't be criminal charges. Do it with dignity.
Those are good words to end on.
All right.
Thank you.